Hi, my name's Dr. Adam Booth, and welcome to another lockdown edition of Quantum Source. Now, many of you out there might recognise this as the board game Pandemic. This is a board game that's based around the premise of trying to save the world from global epidemics. It's quite close to home, as you can imagine. And your pawns are one of a crack team of pandemic specialists. So you could be a researcher, you could be a scientist, you could be a medic, a quarantine specialist. And basically you try and stop these little cubes, which represent diseases, spreading around the world. So at the moment, the board game is not looking in the best of health, and the implication being that humanity is on the verge of global collapse. Now, in the pre-lockdown world, this was one of mine and Jane's favourite games to play. Hi, Jane, who is working from home today. But as I say, it now seems a little bit close to home, and so it's not really come out of the box for the last few months because it's just a little bit depressing to lose in this way. So today in Quantum Source, we're talking board games, and our speaker, who we're going to call in a few minutes' time, is Dr Melissa Rogerson. She is a lecturer in the University of Melbourne School of Computing and Information Systems. And yeah, we're going to give her a bell to talk about the rise and continued rise of board games. As always, fascinating facts were best served with something refreshing, and today's recommendation is in celebration of the town of Essen, which is a town in Germany where there's a big board game festival that's held every year. Essen being one of the towns in the game of Pandemic. And so I'm recommending a nice German Weissbier, so get yourself something nice and we'll give Melissa a call. Cheers. And hello, Melissa, there you are. Good morning, or actually I should say good evening. You're in Melbourne.
Good evening indeed, yes.
And I understand that you've been in video conference all day already, so thanks very much for joining us on your evening. What's refreshing you after that big video conference?
I'm actually treating myself to the very last of my favourite drink. It's an Easter egg filled with Baileys.
All right. Cheers.
So cheers indeed.
I would join you in a nice German beer, but it's 10:30 here, and maybe that's not the best idea in the world, but later I will be raising a glass to you and a Baileys filled Easter egg.
Fantastic. I am actually having the other kind of sauce a little later. My husband looked at me and went, "It's a grilled cheese with Worcestershire sauce night tonight, isn't it?" I was like, "Oh, yeah."
Nice one. Nice one. Now, if I didn't know already that you were a researcher in board games, your background would have convinced me of exactly that. So, wow.
Shall we do the tip? I'll just. This is my dining room. I do have to apologise because we've been in lockdown for a while and things are maybe not quite as tidy as they ought to be.
That's tidy to my own board game stash, which is just probably thrown on a shelf. That's well organised board games, I have to say.
Well, one of the things that board gamers love to show off is their shelfies, right? The photos of their shelves. So you just got the live shelfie.
There we go. Right, a Quantum Source exclusive. Thank you very much. So the rise and continued rise of board games. Let's give us some perspectives on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love this quote, right? Paul Booth, who's a researcher, says we're in the midst of a board game renaissance, right? Yeah. And since about the late 1970s, there's been this real resurgence in board game design and in interest in board games. And so we see these words like renaissance and golden age coming up to describe that interest. And I particularly, there's a few headlines. I like the one that says it's official, board games are cool now, just in case we were worried, right? Always reassuring. But much of the growth that we're seeing is actually in that sort of 25 to 35-year-old age range as well. People who maybe played video games when they were growing up and they're looking maybe for a little bit more face-to-face connections sometimes. And in particular, we see that board game cafes, board game bars are turning out to be really popular places for first dates and second dates. Maybe you can learn a lot from somebody when you sit across the table from them.
Yeah, you learn, is this a life partner? Can they actually handle getting owned in a game?
That's right. Did they flip the table?
That's right.
Dad. And one of the things that's really driving that, and that age group in particular are driving, is Kickstarter and crowdfunding sites. And games is like a massive category for Kickstarter. And people go, oh, yeah, that'll be video games. But actually the value of the board games on Kickstarter is nearly 11 times the value of what they're making on video games, right? So these are...
crowdfunding, you're saying?
Crowdfunding, yeah.
Right, okay.
So people going, I've got this really great idea. This is my game that I'm going to make. You see a lot less of that for video games.
Right.
With board games, we see some massive games, right? Games that are funded at $5 million. Oh, that's Australian dollars. That's probably about £2.50. But no, it's probably about,
at the moment,
350 million pounds.
Yeah.
So huge amounts of money being committed, being made on the site. And it's not all the big blockbuster games. There's also been quite good interest at that lower end where people are like, look, I'd kind of like to make 100 copies of my game and it's going to cost me about, $5,000, £3,000. Can you help me out? And we've seen more than $1 billion pledged on Kickstarter in the 10 years since they launched to tabletop gaming projects. Yeah, wow. So the other thing, of course, that's really interesting about this is that almost every blog post where they talk about games, they're talking about the video games that people are selling on the site. So there's kind of the board game stuff seems to come from the people that are already interested in board games.
Yeah, okay.
And then when we look at research on board games, we see that there is a little bit out there, but it tends to look at either kind of historical artifacts and say, okay, well, we dug up this thing and, we think it's a game.
Board games kind of thing, like this is how the ancient Egyptians used to spend the time or whatever.
Exactly. Let's find all the examples of nine men's Morris scratched into the back of pews in churches around Britain.
Yeah.
Or as design artifacts, or also as programming challenges. We see, a lot of this in universities where students are asked to implement a game. But what we don't see is people studying the interaction that happens when we're sitting around a table playing a game together.
Yeah. I mean, is that kind of like, I don't know if there's like an academic snobbery there, or does it fall between the gaps of, psychology, sociology, and then, the kind of research goes on in your department, the more kind of like computational stuff? Is that, or it's just such a new field that people haven't caught up with it?
Yeah, look, I think that there's been a tendency to think of board games as old-fashioned and think of board games as kind of something that people used to play, and now we play video games, right?
Yeah.
Now, we know that's wrong, but there tends to be that kind of thinking. And also the people who study interaction, right, people like me, my department's called Human-Computer Interaction. But these are the computers that I'm studying, right? They're not the kind that have wires and circuits and things.
Sure, yeah.
And my research approach, I suppose, was really influenced by a short paper by a guy called Staffan Bjork, who talked about the challenges of understanding games research when some of it comes from maths and some of it comes from cultural studies and sociology and computer science. And how do you go, okay, well, this is what maths thinks and this is what these other groups think. And his suggestion, which I really took to heart, was that instead of looking at what discipline the research came out of, we should look at what it's focused on. So is this research that's about games? Is it research that's about gamers? Or is it research that's about gaming?
Yeah.
And that works really nicely for me because it ties so beautifully with that human-computer interaction.
Right, yeah.
And when I talk about what I see in board games, I suppose I am talking more broadly about other forms of material interaction as well, right? But my research philosophy has very much been guided by this core idea that it's actually enough just to study games because they're games, right?
Yeah.
They're not out there saving lives. They're not out there preventing road trauma. They're not out there, I don't know, solving new computational problems. But there's something that people do and something that people love to do.
Totally.
And so we should absolutely be studying them and understanding them. And we can understand too that maybe they tell us about other things. And it's useful sometimes to say, well, this is something I learned from gaming or something I observed from gaming. But at the same time, it's enough for it just to be, we like games.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
Yeah. So what I thought I'd do is just run you through kind of some of the research that I've done in the past, some of the interesting things that I think I've found, and then talk about what I've been working on lately as well.
Okay.
So I started off trying to understand the games, I suppose, and trying to understand the technology. So I looked at 3 popular games that exist as physical games and also as digital games. Okay. And this is kind of about thinking about the games as being made of stuff, right? They're things, they're made of stuff, they've got bits, they're designed, and there are things that are kind of built into the assumptions that we make when we play those games. And so one of them is about how much do we need to know what's going on and how much is allowed to be what we call magic, right? How much can just kind of happen. In board games, we typically know a lot more about what's going on, whereas in a digital game, things can just happen. We don't have to make them happen.
Right.
The other thing that's special about board games is the chores that we do. And it turns out that, you know, moving pieces, shuffling the deck, putting cards at the bottom of the deck, all of this helps to support the way that we understand the game and the way that we understand how the game is played. And there's some great research that was done in Canada that shows that the more magical the interface, the more those chores are hidden, the harder it is to actually understand sometimes how you're playing the game, what's going on in the game.
Yeah.
And if you've ever learned a game on a digital device and then tried to play it in the physical world, maybe you've done better than me, but I've played a couple of games where I've realised I actually have no idea how to score this game. I've got no idea how the scoring works because something just did it in the background all the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And the last thing is this idea of theory crafting, and this comes from massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft, where people are trying to work out how something works, and they work it out by kind of throwing their character at it, or throwing lots and lots of people, lots of time at this problem and recording what happens in each situation to try to understand what's going to happen if you do those things in the future. What are the odds of something happening? And we actually see that with some of these digital board games. When that data becomes available, suddenly you're playing a game. I think my husband's got one game he's played 10,000 times on his device. That's an awful lot of time. He should have been doing other things, right? But you know, if you've done that, you've generated this enormous amount of data, and computers are really good at capturing data, and we're not very good at capturing data. So we're very good at looking at a hand of cards and going, I reckon that's going to be a better move, right? That's what I want to do. But actually informing that with data becomes quite interesting. I'm kind of on the fence about this, right? I'm a bit of a pantser. I prefer to play by the seat of my pants rather than puzzle it all out. But there are lots of people who do like to really kind of crack those algorithms and try and work out the different odds of something happening.
And that's right. Just last night I was playing cards with Jane, and you know, you face some 50-50 decisions when you're gonna, you know, what card you're gonna throw out in a game of rummy. And I know that if I had my computer in front of me, I could probably just knock up a little bit of code to tell me what would be the best thing to do here. But I don't have that, and I know that if I'd have had it, I could have won. But you know, maybe that takes away something of the fun and the risk element anyway.
Yeah,
and that's a game.
I have this theory that maybe when we play with someone and we say, I just don't like the way that they play, maybe it's because they're the opposite than we are. You know, maybe we're a pantser, it sounds like you are too, and they're a puzzler. And so they think, why isn't this person playing properly? They should be calculating all the odds. And we're sitting there going, oh, would you just take your move and, get on with it? When I look at the human, right, what in human-computer interaction we call this understanding the user. So I did some really deep, long interviews with hobbyist gamers from Australia, from Europe, including the UK, and from the United States. And I used a theory called serious leisure, right? And serious leisure is about that really involved participation that we have in a hobby or in a pursuit where we do it as much as we can. It's not like, I go to the movies once a fortnight or once a month or something. It's I go to the movies every night and I see 3 movies and then I go home and I read about them, right? So this is that distinction perhaps between serious leisure and casual leisure. And for those serious leisure board games, I found what I'm calling the 4 pillars of hobbyist enjoyment. And so they love the materiality of a game, being able to touch the pieces. One of the people I interviewed talked about the sensuous joy of feeling the pieces running through his hands, They talk about sociality, right? Having those conversations. It's hard to sit at a table and not have a conversation with people. They talk about intellectual challenge, right? Which is that puzzling side of things, trying to work out what's going on, what's likely to happen if I take this move. And they talk about variety, right, which is, where the shelves come in. It's not about having 2 games that you play all the time. It's about having lots of games and having people often talk about having the right game for the right group of people. If I've got 7 people come over and 2 of them don't like word games, what do I play?
Right, yeah. Well, the right game for the right time, like I was saying in my intro. Pandemic at the moment just feels a little bit close to the bone.
Yeah, I'm with you. I can't play it at the moment. So, although I did see that there's a new print and play game just been released from the pandemic series. It sounds really cheap. You need to know it was released well. It was planned well before this pandemic hit because it's called Pandemic Hot Zone North America.
Ah, right. Okay. So.
But you can download it, you can print it, you can actually play the game. So.
Yeah, okay.
So moving on then from these sort of 4 pillars of what we do, we took our understanding of what people do on sites like BoardGameGeek.com and we compared it to the behaviours that we saw on 2 other websites that were dedicated to these sort of offline hobbies. So Ravelry.com, which is a site for yarn crafting, right? Knitting and crochet and I think even spinning and things. And also Goodreads.com, which is a site about reading books. And I've got some students right now who are extending this. One of them's looking at people who are hobbyist jewellery makers and another one is looking at people who get tattoos. I can't call it people who collect tattoos because,
There's something a bit Silence of the Lambs about that, isn't there?
It really is, yeah. But what we want to see is whether our findings from board gaming, from knitting, from reading hold true in those settings as well. And we found that even though people think that their hobby is purely physical, right? They think that they're that it's something that involves face-to-face contact and working with their hands. Actually, there's all these digital practices that support and surround what they do offline, and we call it the digital hinterland, borrowing that idea from geography, right, where the hinterland is the area that supports and sustains a port. And we've identified these 5 activities that are common to each of these sites. So people do research on what to buy, on how to knit something, on what book they might want to read next. They collect, right? They buy things through the site and often they sell them as well. Managing your collection is a really active process. They keep a catalogue of what they own, whether that's their games or their stash of unused yarn or their to-read pile. They talk to other people about what they're doing, sharing pictures, asking for opinions, and this is often where that idea of kind of a community comes in. And they keep track of what they're doing, right? Logging their plays, logging what they're reading. I've got an app on my phone that lists every single board game I've played since 2015, right?
Wow.
And it's normal when I'm playing games with people, everyone will get out their phone and fire up their little app. And of course, this work on Hinterlands is really topical now because we can't go out to practice our hobbies, right? But we're still able to engage with them online and to learn about things and try new things and share what we're doing. The other thing that I looked at was what happens when people play games. So trying to understand the interactions that happen when people play games. And in this picture, I've got 4 people playing a competitive game called Concordia. It's actually one of my favourite games. And the player in the lower right corner who's wearing a pair of glasses that actually track her gaze. That's what that little circle is, so we can see what she's looking at. She's in the process of selecting a card to play, and the card that she plays is going to let her take an action. But if you look up, the player to her right who's sitting opposite her, he's already gone through his cards and he's stacked them in order of how he wants to play them. So on his next turn, he just flips over the top card and then he plays it. So he's actually using the components, using the pieces of the game here to plan what he's going to do and to create what we call a planning artifact. So the pieces become kind of a tool for playing the game as well as the things that you play the game with. And so this granularity of pieces turns out to be really important. This is related to chores, right, and to the importance of moving the pieces around. And we know that one of the things that game developers who build digital games want to do is get rid of the fiddly parts like pieces. And so that, again, that generates this interesting tension between, well, actually the pieces are quite important to players. So here, for instance, I'll just touch on a couple of the things on this board. Down the bottom, this is a game called Stone Age, and this is actually from the iOS implementation of it. You can see that I've got 1 wood, I've got no bricks, I've got 2 stone, I've got no gold, right, in those spaces down the bottom.
You're doing pretty well chicken drumsticks, though, by the looks of it.
Yeah, I'm quite a fan of chicken.
No.
And a screen like this has huge amounts of information on it, but it doesn't let you move the pieces around for planning. But we do know that people use these tools. So, for example, the 2 houses at the top of the screen in the centre, right? If I wanted to buy those, one of them's going to cost me a wood and a stone and a gold and be worth 14 points. The other's going to cost me a wood and a brick and a stone and be worth 12 points. Now, if I were playing this game face-to-face, I'd have 2 little piles of resources, right, that I'd be putting together going, okay, and I might be kind of trying to be subtle about it so that the other people at the table can't see. But those physical resources are a really important part of that planning element. So I'm really interested to explore how that planning and how sorting your pieces, ordering the pieces, can be reflected in digital games as well as in board games. So, okay, we know that it's important. We know that it's important that board games are stuff, right, and that they've got bits. So why are people playing games that reduce the amount of stuff and bits that we've got? And this kind of brings me into my most recent project where I'm looking at hybrid games, games that combine a digital tool with the physical board game. And this is supported by a not-for-profit in France called Game in Lab, who've been fantastic. So does anyone remember this guy?
I remember this guy, and he is bringing back some horrible childhood memories. Yeah, I'm not sure I can easily look at that image, actually. If I saw that guy walking down the street, I might, I don't know what I'd do. This is it Nightmare? Was that the name of the game?
That's what it was called. I think in the UK it might have been called Atmosphere.
That was the one. Of course, yeah. Atmosphere with an F.
That's right. And the tagline was turn the volume up and the lights down.
Yeah.
Right. And this was one of the first board games that used the sort of multimedia elements that we're starting to see more and more of now. And it used a VHS video, which acted as a timer. So you would put on the VHS video, it ran for an hour, and different programmed events kind of happened during that hour. And most of them involved this creepy guy showing up and shouting at you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure that we actually made it through. I think I probably got too freaked out.
And as games go, right, Nightmare was absolutely rubbish. The random events were just completely meaningless. You know, miss 5 turns, go back to the start. But people loved it because there was this super cheesy acting and also this sense that you were doing something that was more than just what was inside the box. But, of course, it was produced on VHS, and there aren't a lot of people that still have VHS players. So for a long time it was unplayable, although if you poke around on YouTube, there is an unofficial copy of the video there. And I don't have the rights to rebroadcast it here, but I played the trailer at a conference earlier this year and, you know, we turned the lights down and the volume up as they told us. And it's still...
When the lights come up, you find that half of your audience is just in a cold sweat, like it's shivering.
It's completely nuts, right? And it's such fun.
Yeah.
And thinking about Nightmare, right, which is a game which is, as I said, completely programmed. There's nothing. There's not a lot of chance that comes in. Certainly, no chance in the VHS tape. A little bit through the cards. But when we think about that, that brings us to games where there's actual interactivity rather than just a pretense at it, and where the interactivity is actually serving gameplay. It's more than just a gimmick. And, you know, we're seeing a small boom in these games, you know, maybe 150 or so of them at the moment. So not a huge number, but the vast majority of those have been produced in the last 3 or 4 years. Okay. And what I found when I started to look at them was that we don't really have any language for describing hybrid board games. So I've got pictures of 3 games here. There's Descent, The Road to Legend, which uses an app to kind of procedurally generate a dungeon space that people are exploring. Harry Potter Seen It, which gives you trivia content on a DVD, and Detective, where people interact with an online database to try and solve a crime. And they all end up in this same bucket where we usually say, oh, it's a board game with an app, which is actually wrong for 2 of these games anyway. But we don't have a more nuanced and more detailed way of talking about it. And in fact, even when we use words like it's a hybrid game, we find that being a hybrid game is a lot like being art, right? I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. I don't know much about hybrid games, but I'll call things hybrid games and think that's meaningful, right? And so I'm trying to kind of map out this space and understand this space, and I have literally, I think, the worst diagram ever. But I'm trying to kind of get at what's going on in some of these games. Do they have an app that helps you play, but you don't have to play with it? Are there surrounding apps? There's an app called Chiwazi that's very popular where everybody who's playing just puts their finger on somebody's phone screen and it automatically picks a start player for you. Right. There are games like Operation, right, where you're completing a circuit, but is it a hybrid game? You know, I'm not quite sure. So I'm sort of trying to play through some of these ideas, and even some of the old games, play-by-mail games like Star Web, where players physically mailed in their orders, but then they were entered into a computer, the computer resolved the orders, and then they were mailed out to the players again. So how do we conceptualise these different kinds of games that use technology in some way? So Board Games with Batteries is my new band name.
I'll look out for the hit single.
That's right, yeah. It might be called Nightmare Returns.
Right, yeah. Let's not.
Turn the volume up and the lights down. So I've got this kind of working definition of a hybrid game where I'm saying it's a physical game that's augmented by an app or a computer program that's required for play of the game. And one of the interesting things that I think here is that a lot of these hybrids use equipment that the player already owns, right? It's not created specifically for the game. You played Nightmare, you already had a VHS, right? You play some of these other games, you already have a mobile phone or a computer that you're using. 3 quick examples of things that I would consider hybrids under that definition. The Unlock series of games, which are escape room type games where, you have a card and it's got an ultraviolet light on it, and you have another card and it's got a dinosaur bone on it. And you're like, what happens if I combine these together? Let's ask the app and it will tell me. Yeah. Mask of the Pharaoh. Basically, you have this Google Cardboard style device that you wear on your face that looks like the head of Anubis, and you mount a mobile phone inside that device. And one player wears that and they see a map of part of a maze, which they have to describe to the other players who try to build it using cardboard components.
Wow.
I'm not sure that I'd choose to play it often, but it's really fun, right? And this other one, Woofy Whoops, which is a game where you pat a plastic dog until it semi-randomly decides to wee on you. And I was really excited to see this game because it actually then takes a video of the person who the dog is weeing on from a smartphone. And it's clearly a gimmick, right? It's a rubbish game, but it's not something that I'd seen before. And it ties into this whole idea of kind of shareable moments from play, because who doesn't want to watch the dog wee on their brother over and over and over? And the point of doing this research was to kind of understand what different tools are being used and what functions those tools are playing. So if we think about something like a timer in a game, right? A timer, well, it tells you when 5 minutes are up or when 6 minutes are up or 2 minutes are up. But I think I said earlier, the video that came with Nightmare, well, that was a timer as well, right? It was counting down until something happened. And so when I try and break down those functions and understand, for example, what happens with a timer, it's much, much more complex than we think. So it might be orchestrating the game. It might be saying, this happens now, you need to do this now. It might be counting down to something or counting up to something. It might be timing rounds within the game, or it might be kind of delivering random events or scripted events at particular times. So there's a lot of things that are going on just in this idea of a timer. And that's just kind of one of the functions that we found. We found actually 24 different distinct things that were going on inside these games through a combination of asking people, right, what do games do, talking to game designers, and also doing some, we call it critical play. It's definitely not just sitting around having a beer with your friends and playing a game, but actually playing through the games, right, and trying to unpack what's going on there. And we've grouped those into 11 main categories, which you can see here on the slide, this sort of descriptive categories that describe what's going on. So timing, sensing, teaching, representing, results and resolution. This is still in draft form, right? We haven't finalised these categories yet. We're not sure that we've got the best words to describe each of them, but it's really trying to build this model that says, well, how can we talk about these games beyond saying it's a board game with an app? And then is that something that we're giving back to researchers who are looking at what can we do with these technologies? But also to game designers who can say, okay, well, I'm designing this game and I thought about using an app, but what are the things that I can use it for? And again, going back to that example of a timer, a lot of games use an hourglass to time, but that's a really interesting interaction because, of course, your attention is split between watching the hourglass and watching what's going on within the space of the game, right? Whereas if you've got a timer, you don't need to split your attention because the timer's going to ring. That might be something that the game designer wants to do, or it might actually be that they really want your attention to be split. They want that, and that potential for error too that we have in a board game. Maybe you just don't notice.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's kind of an overview, I suppose, of some of the different ways that we can study board games and understand not just the games themselves, but also the way that they fit into people's lives and the way that they're supported by different practices, different technologies.
Cool. Well, thanks very much. It's really amazing how multifaceted it is, actually, and how kind of like active and when you just scratch the surface, how many different fields come into this.
Oh, very much. And you know, even when I sort of started researching these things in about 2014, 2015, it never would have occurred to me that there was such a lot going on, and that I took this model to a conference earlier in the year, and somebody said to me, well, there's your next 10 years of work. And I thought, you know, you could easily spend that sort of time just delving into this area. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and you're really riding the wave, given this this renaissance that's going on.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I really have to tip my hat to people like Stuart Woods, who I think his book came out in 2012, and it was really the first exploration of particularly hobbyist board gamers, and, you know, really ahead of his time there.
Yeah. Can I just ask one question, and that's that obviously, I imagine that whenever you yourself play a game, you're also looking at the research elements of this, and you know, I hope that doesn't take away any of the enjoyment for you. But what particular types of game do you yourself really enjoy?
I like deep strategic games. So I think I said Concordia that I showed you is one of my favourite games. Right? It takes about 2 hours to play. It's very, very thinky game. My microphone's doing something weird, sorry. My very favourite game at the moment, and for the last couple of years, has been a game called Terraforming Mars.
Okay.
It's a game for 2 to 5 players. Again, very thinky, but with interesting random elements as well, which is not something I usually like in a game.
Okay.
But I only ever play it 2-player with my husband. So that's a game that we would only ever play head-to-head. And it's kind of our nuts game. You know, it's the game that we've got all the expansions, we can play with everything, and sometimes it's taken 5.5 hours to play a game.
Okay.
Weird. That's weird for me. It's not the kind of game that I usually enjoy. I usually enjoy a game that takes sort of that 45 minutes to an hour and a half kind of space. And we'd call them modern European board games or Euro games. But, you know, I'm pretty eclectic. So I saw that the German Game of the Year awards have just been, the shortlists have just been announced. And a couple of the games there I think are absolutely marvellous. There's a game called The Crew, which is just coming out in English, and it's a cooperative trick-taking game. And it starts really easy, and then very quickly you're like, oh my goodness, you know, how are we going to solve this? And it's just marvellous. And I grew up playing games like Oh Hell and Bridge, so I love trick-taking games.
Yeah.
And the other one is a game, it's on the children's game nominated list. It's a game called Hedgehog Roll. And you've got this board with like leaves and forest fruits, I think apples and things, and mushrooms scattered along the board. And what you have to do, you've got a tennis ball, and you roll the tennis ball across the board, and it picks up pieces which have a Velcro backing on them. And you then use those pieces to move. So if you've got an apple, you can move to a space with an apple if you picked it up when you rolled the tennis ball across the table. So it's a completely silly, but enormously fun.
Cool. That's enormously fun. I think that's a really good watchword for where we'll leave this now. What I would say to the Quantum Source audience, if you do have any questions that you want to put to Melissa, then you'll see that in the slides that she was presenting, her Twitter handle is down there, and I think she's really happy to take any questions about the wonderful world of board games from anyone out there. So yeah, well, thank you again, Melissa, and we will leave you to your Melbourne evening, and we'll say bye.
Thanks for having me.
It's been great. Cheers now.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so lots of food for thought from Melissa there for when you next get your board game out. I'm going to wrap this up quick because I have a slight paranoia that the dude from Atmosphere is going to be sneaking up behind me. What I would say is the beauty of board games is that if you end up with a world that looks like this, you can just scrape them all the way, put them back in the box and start all over again. So I really hope that it's not too long before our own world starts to look like this in real life. If you enjoyed that, then do keep your eye out on the Quantum Source Twitter and Instagram feeds for more updates. We will be posting more podcasts to keep you educated and entertained during lockdown times. But it just remains for me to say that I've been Dr. Adam Booth. That's been Jane. Bye, Jane. This has been Quantum Source, and you've been great. Stay well.